please join me in welcoming Professor Phillip Johnson.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here at Princeton again after a 3 or 4 year absence, and it's particularly a great pleasure tonight because Princeton, as it happens, is the last stop on my 9.5-week lecture tour following the publication of Reason and the Balance. I've been at many of the universities, the largest universities in this country, and 10 days in Spain at 3 different universities, living out of a suitcase the whole time. I just have to finish up here and then go to Washington for a National Public Radio broadcast on Monday, and then finally I'll be back at home in sunny California. So I'm really glad to be with you for a while. Now, you know, if we ask the question about can science know the mind of God, what everybody's going to think about right away, in fact, what you're meant to think about, is one of the surprise best-selling books of all time, A Brief History of Time by the physicist Stephen Hawking of Cambridge University in England. Stephen Hawking, of course, is now known everywhere around the world as the brilliant scientist who tragically, as a young man, became progressively crippled with what Americans call Lou Gehrig's disease, and has ended up as an individual who is physically as helpless as it's possible to be, unable to move, not only confined to a wheelchair, but unable to speak or to communicate as most people do, although due to a technological marvel and the very limited amount of movement he has left in his hands, he can activate a voice synthesizer which speaks with an artificial voice for him. He wrote this book for the public about his physical theories, A Brief History of Time, frankly for money-making purposes. He needed to earn some money to pay his children's tuition. He didn't expect to make very much money. The initial printing was 5,000 copies, but within a few years this book had sold 5 million copies. He ended up a worldwide celebrity on the cover of Newsweek with the caption, "Master of the Universe." And one can see the tremendous imaginative appeal. Hawking is, of course, a brilliant scientist, and that's part of the appeal, but the public can understand directly only a very little part of the science. In fact, many people have suggested that A Brief History of Time is one of the most unread bestsellers of all time. But the very idea that a person in such a state of complete physical helplessness would possibly promise to discover the ultimate secrets of the universe, to make sense out of things altogether, this is a tremendously appealing idea, an enactment of the human spirit and mind overcoming material deficiencies, of mind over matter. And indeed, Hawking offered his readers a tremendously exhilarating promise of universal understanding. In terms of the physics, what he promised was that, he said, physics is on the verge of discovering the final theory, as some call it, the theory of everything, as others call it, the complete unified theory of the fundamental forces of physics. And because of the philosophy that he adopts, this theory, the theory of how the forces of electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear force, and gravity were unified at the earliest moment of the Big Bang, would be a theory of everything that has happened since. Why? Because, well, if you assume that the universe started with material particles and impersonal laws, and if you knew the state of the particles, and if you knew the nature of the laws, then, since nothing has entered the universe afterwards, nothing has happened that wasn't present already in those laws and those particles at the beginning, you would have, in principle, and these are Hawking's own words, a complete understanding of the events around us and of our existence. That is, that physics offered, he said, the possibility of a complete understanding of everything, the events around us and of our own existence. The first big step towards this goal was to be a unified theory of the four fundamental forces of nature. Once that unified theory was discovered, Hawking said, it will be possible to teach philosophers and then even ordinary people something of what the theory means. Eventually, this knowledge would then enable everyone to take part in a great conversation about such grand questions as why it is that we in the universe exist. Why is there something instead of nothing? And finding the answer to that riddle of existence, Hawking concluded in the very famous final sentences of his book, would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. Now, what Hawking was talking about when he said, then we would know the mind of God, was not, at least as it appears in the context of the book, the God that people think of as the God of the Bible, the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, a supernatural being outside of nature who created it. Rather, what Hawking seemed to have in mind was that through the pursuit of scientific knowledge, human beings would take on God's omniscience. You see, they would know everything that there is to be known. They would have a complete understanding of the events around us and of our own existence. Now, if you take even the most modest skeptical stance towards this picture, you can see at once that there are some things about it which are strikingly unlikely to be fulfilled. For one thing, particle physics, the kind of thing that Hawking does, is absolutely unintelligible to people other than specialists in the fields. One has to have a very advanced mathematical knowledge to know what they're talking about. And yet he, without explaining, held out the promise that if the particle physicists found their goal, they could somehow explain it to philosophers and then to everybody else. It could become common knowledge. You see, it would become part of the common knowledge of everyone. And more than that, he seemed to think that this knowledge of physical events, of physical cause and effects, could cross the barrier between the how questions, how do things happen, to the why questions. Once we had a perfect knowledge of how things happened, we would know the why. And it's with knowing the why, you see, that we understand the mind of God. Does it seem like a very naive vision? Well, yes, in fact, it really is. And that's why it's so interesting that this very naive, romantic, and impossible vision of what scientific investigation could provide created this tremendous worldwide stir, you see. It was a kind of imaginative fiction that captured the public mind because, as that Newsweek cover story said, it promised that we could become the masters of the universe, you see, that this scientific knowledge of material cause and effect could give us what people seek, a way of making sense out of reality as a whole and coming to master it. Now, the naive optimism, the naive rationalism of that view of what scientific knowledge could provide is very much at odds with what we hear from some more sophisticated voices in the academic world. One of these that I'll just use as an all-purpose example at this point is Richard Rorty, the famous philosopher who was a professor at this university, I believe, at an earlier stage in his career, but is now at the University of Virginia, who is a leading proponent of a view of the world which does not take this same a hopeful stance that we can understand reality as it really is, then we can have a complete understanding of the events around us and of our own existence. In fact, in a recent article, Rorty says that one of the firm conclusions of contemporary philosophy is that it is impossible to imagine that we could, through investigation and thinking, achieve what he calls a full, objective, true account of nature, of things as they really are. You see, this is in his wording, the same thing that Hawking is saying when he says a complete understanding of the events around us and of our own existence. Why couldn't we have this complete understanding of nature, this complete unified understanding which would be true for everybody? Well, Rorty says, it's because of the very process of scientific investigation to which Hawking appeals. What do we get out of scientific investigation? If we take the scientific investigation of our times as the true account of reality, as Rorty does, what does it tell us? Well, he says, it tells us that we are the products of Darwinian evolution, of evolution by mutation and natural selection, of material processes that rewarded only success in reproducing and in leaving offspring. And, to quote Rorty's words, the idea that one species of organisms is, unlike all the others, oriented not just towards its own increased prosperity, but towards truth with a capital T, is as un-Darwinian as the idea that every human being has a built-in moral compass, a conscience that tells us intuitively the difference between right and wrong. You see, so that the very idea that science gives us about ourselves, that what we are is a species that evolved to its present condition through natural selection, a process which rewards only success in leaving offspring, makes it impossible to conceive that this one animal species should have an orientation towards absolute truth instead of towards its own increased prosperity. It's as absurd, he said, as the idea that we have an intuitive knowledge of right and wrong. Now, that notion, the way he put that, struck a particular chord in me because, as you know, as you've been told, I'm a professor of law in my regular academic work and a professor of criminal law. And one of the things I know about our legal system is that it presumes that every individual has an intuitive, innate understanding of a difference between right and wrong, between moral right and moral wrong, a moral right and moral wrong that exists independently of the legal system. And that is why the definition of insanity for legal purposes, the insanity that will make you not liable to a criminal conviction, is that you've lost that understanding. A person is insane if, due to mental disease or defect, he or she is unable to understand the moral wrongfulness of the act. But this view, which is so central to our system of criminal responsibility, is to Rorty inconceivable that it could actually be true that we would have a sense of an objective right or wrong, just as it is inconceivable that we would have an orientation to finding absolute truth, a complete understanding of our world, because all we can really know is what works for us in our particular condition in time. So the very understanding of science that Stephen Hawking appealed to suggest we could come to some universal knowledge turns out to call the whole prospect of universal knowledge into question. Now, if you want to see that development in its perhaps fullest flower, that notion that a true scientific understanding of the world destroys rather than furthers the notion that there is a rationality to the world as a whole, you won't have to go any further than the current issue of Scientific American, which features an article by Richard Dawkins, the most prominent advocate of Darwinism in our time, an article taken from his latest book, which is called River Out of Eden. And the article is titled God's Utility Function. The subtitle, the summary of the article is right under the title, states the message of the article. It says, humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. According to Richard Dawkins, life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. And in this article, Richard Dawkins explains his very well-known view of the Darwinian process, that the Darwinian process is a process which, once life has started in the first place, is a process of selecting and rewarding those genes, those stretches of genetic material, of DNA, which are better than other stretches of material of DNA at leaving copies of themselves. And that the whole process of life is just a process of DNA trying to make more DNA. Now, what's the meaning of this process? Well, one of the things that Richard Dawkins says is that if you even ask that question, a question about the meaning of life, the question, you see, that Richard that Stephen Hawking wanted to ask, you're scientifically illiterate. And he concludes the article by saying, so long as DNA is passed on, it does not matter who or what gets hurt in the process. Genes don't care about suffering because they don't care about anything. In a universe of electrons, the electrons are the stuff that Stephen Hawking studies, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, the stuff that evolutionary biologists study, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, or any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So now here is the fulfillment of the promise of rationality, you see, that was going to come from scientific investigation. What do we get? We get a world of material forces existing to produce more material forces, of DNA producing more DNA, and that's all there is to it. A meaningless, purposeless, completely irrational world. DNA neither knows nor cares. That's the true underlying nature of reality. Now, how do we get to this point? It seems like this effort to understand the mind of God turns out to have the conclusion that God has no mind. There's no mind there to be found. Now, how did this happen? Well, I was lecturing just the other night at another university, the University of Delaware, and a professor of molecular biology who was objecting to the message he understood I would be delivering, came to the lecture and passed out copies of an article that he thought would refute everything that I said. Now, I was delighted to see this. I knew the article. It was something that was already familiar to me, and I thought, goodness, what a wonderful illustration this gives of just my point. So I'll use it here tonight with you as well. The essay is from the Journal of Molecular Evolution, and it's by a very prominent and distinguished molecular biologist at UCLA, the University of California at Los Angeles, named Richard Dickerson. The essay is titled The Game of Science, and I can tell you that it was written with me particularly in mind, because it was published in this journal just a while after they had opened their pages to me to write an essay, you see. And so, although he doesn't name me in it, there are references in it which clearly indicate that it's written in part to answer what I had said. Now, he begins this essay, The Game of Science, with the following statement. Science fundamentally is a game. It is a game with one overriding and defining rule. Rule number one. This is the overriding and defining rule of science. Let us see how far and to what extent we can explain the behavior of the physical and material universe in terms of purely physical and material causes without invoking the supernatural. I'll read that to you again. This is rule number one that defines the scientific game. Let us see how far and to what extent we can explain the behavior of the physical and material universe in terms of purely physical and material causes without invoking the supernatural. Now, right away, it occurs to me that it's rather an interesting rule number one for scientific investigation. Notice that rule number one is not, let's be sure we report the evidence accurately. Or let's be sure that we don't go beyond the evidence to claim more than we really know from scientific investigation. In fact, nowhere in the body of the essay are any rules of that kind suggested or even mentioned. The entire body of the essay is consistent with this beginning point. The purpose of science is to go as far as we can in explaining reality without invoking the supernatural, in explaining reality in terms of purely physical and material causes. Moreover, Professor Dickerson goes on in this article, which was much celebrated at the time, and I think is indeed represents a very dominant way of thinking among scientists of his kind, to say that while it may be true that we do not at present have a materialist explanation for every aspect of reality, the process of seeking such investigations, the success of science has been such that we have reason for confidence that eventually this scientific enterprise will succeed in providing materialist explanations for the things for which such explanations are at present temporarily lacking. And that the worst thing that science can possibly do is indulge even for a moment the idea that there may be some things which cannot be explained in that way. Indeed, Dickerson says, and I'll quote his exact sentence, "The most insidious evil of supernatural creationism, the most insidious evil of supernatural creationism is that it stifles curiosity and therefore blunts the intellect." Insidious evil of suggesting that there may not be a materialistic explanation for everything, you see, creates a discouragement towards those who are determined to find those explanations. Now, if, of course, one has a single-minded view, as Professor Dickerson does, that the whole intellectual process of understanding reality is a process which must inherently presume the existence of a materialist explanation for everything, and that while it may recognize temporary setbacks and checks, has an absolute confidence that it will succeed in the long run in filling out that prospect, then one has an outlook which guarantees a materialistic understanding of everything. And since matter has no purposes, matter has no sense of right and wrong, matter has no morality, one gets inevitably out of such a thinking process if it's not checked by something else. You see, if there's not something else that is working in another way, what Richard Dawkins told us we get: a world of pitiless, indifferent, unknowing, purposeless mechanisms, and that's all that there is to it. When I reread this Dickerson essay, as I was discussing it with that audience at the University of Delaware, I was reminded of something I remember from my youth when John F. Kennedy was president, and when the Chief of Staff of the Air Force was a rather bellicose general named Curtis LeMay. You remember Curtis LeMay? LeMay was famous in the Air Force because he was so tremendously effective at carrying out missions. He was a very, very able officer. But he was also famous for being a loose cannon on the deck of the ship of state. I remember his very subtle answer to what we should do about the Vietnam War. It was to bomb them back into the Stone Age. And this was the kind of answer that LeMay seemed to have to every sort of problem. And I remember that President Kennedy, when asked about why he kept General LeMay around, said, well, you know, if you decide to go with the bombers, you absolutely want LeMay to be leading the first wing and in command. But if you're discussing whether or not to go with the bombers, he's the last person you want in the room to deal with that question. And it seems to me that in effect, what Richard Dickerson says is that the operational people, the LeMays, who are good at finding solutions of a particular kind, should be deciding what kind of solutions we should look for. That the bomber pilots should be in the State Department deciding how to meet the overall questions of reality. And of course, they'll always say that every problem can be met with the kind of solution that we know. Now, this same materialistic imperialism, one say, this sense that science looks for materialist explanations, therefore everyone should look for materialist explanations, and therefore we should assume for all purposes that matter is all that there is, and that we live in this unknowing, uncomprehending, meaningless world of material descriptions, is very well expressed in a current book by the philosopher of science Daniel Dennett called Darwin's Dangerous Idea, a book which I've recently reviewed in the October issue of the New Criterion. And I think Daniel Dennett explains what is the crucial scientific step in this materialistic understanding of reality. The crucial scientific proposition that gives people like Richard Dawkins the sense that the right way to understand reality as a whole is to understand it in strictly materialistic and Darwinian terms. What Dennett says that Darwin accomplished, and indeed he gets his science from Dawkins and from the other leading figures of Darwinism, is that Darwin explained design in living organisms in materialist terms. Richard Dawkins begins his famous book, The Blind Watchmaker, by saying that biology is the study of complex things that look as if they were designed by a creator for a purpose. But they were not designed by a creator for a purpose, he says. They were produced by material mechanisms. And Dennett builds on this theme and says that if it's true that our materialist biology of today can take things like the eye, the heart, the brain, the different complex organs of plants and animals, and explain all of these things that look like complicated mechanisms that must have been designed by an intelligent creator, and explain them as the products of a purely material process, then we have good reason, having conquered that great problem, to suppose that all other things will yield to that same type of explanation, and that a scientific, a materialist explanation of everything is at hand, or is at least a reasonable prospect for the future. Here I'll give you Dennett's exact words. He says, Darwin's idea that design in biology could be explained by mutation and natural selection was born as an answer to questions in biology, but it threatened to leak out, offering answers, welcome or not, to questions in cosmology, going in one direction, back to the ultimate beginning, the Big Bang that Stephen Hawking studies, and psychology, going in the other direction, the human mind. Explain that in terms of similar material forces. If the cause of apparent design in biology could be a mindless process of evolution, why couldn't the evolutionary process itself in biology be the product of mindless evolution, and so on all the way down to the ultimate beginning? And if mindless evolution could account for the breathtakingly clever artifacts of the biosphere, how could the products of our own real minds be exempt from an evolutionary explanation? Darwin's idea thus threatened to spread all the way up, dissolving the illusion of our own authorship, our own divine spark of creativity and understanding. So you see, the idea of a materialist explanation of design in biology, by spreading all the way down and all the way up, ends up by explaining our own minds as the product of purely material forces, natural selection, mutation, and dissolves the idea of our own spark, divine spark of creativity and understanding, and thus, as Richard Rorty pointed out to us, the notion that we could be oriented towards absolute truth. What we think is just the product of these material forces. Or as Richard Dawkins put it, DNA neither knows nor cares, and we dance to its music. So rationality itself is dissolved. And yet, although rationality itself is dissolved by this system, the system is presented by its adherents as being the only possible rational system. And indeed, in the words of Richard Dawkins, if you meet someone who doubts evolution in this sense, it is absolutely safe to say that they are ignorant, superstitious, or even wicked. He says, but he'd rather not consider that. And Daniel Dennett addresses the following statement to parents who presume to teach their children anything other than that human beings are the product of evolution by natural selection. I'll quote his exact words. If you insist on teaching your children falsehoods, that the earth is flat, that man, in quotes, that man, quote, quote, is not a product of evolution by natural selection, then you must expect, at the very least, at the very least, that those of us who have freedom of speech will feel free to describe your teachings as the spreading of falsehoods, and will attempt to demonstrate this to your children at our earliest opportunity. Our future well-being, the well-being of all of us on the planet, depends upon the education of our descendants. And so we find in this great democracy dedicated to freedom of expression and freedom of thought, the thought that, of course, it's exactly the same thing that occurred to the scientific materialists of the Soviet Union. If you doubt our system, you're insane. And we will take your children from you and teach them the truth. And we will treat you as the completely irrational creatures that you are. Now, what is so ironic about this whole system is that, like its Marxist counterpart, it's the Darwinian's version of scientific materialism, this totalitarian scientific materialism, is founded at bottom on a rather simple misunderstanding. The claim, the essential claim, is that the material processes of mutation and selection have explained how we get complicated things like hearts and livers and wings and eyes and hearing systems and immune systems and photosynthesis mechanisms and all of those things. But if you ask for an example of this system in operation, ask for an example of seeing natural selection actually doing something creative, you'll get one of 3 or 4 different examples that show something very different. You will be told, well, that it is known that there is a species of peppered moth that has some dark moths and has some light moths. And the light moths are better adapted for surviving under some conditions, and the dark moths are better adapted for surviving under other conditions. If the trees are light, the light moths are better camouflaged. If the trees are dark, the dark moths are better camouflaged. And so depending on the background color of the trees, you may have a predominance of light or dark moths in the population. And you may be told that the beaks of finches vary in size, and that large beaks are better adapted for some conditions and smaller beaks are better adapted for other conditions, depending on the plentifulness and size of the seeds that are available for eating. And the average size of beaks in a finch population may be larger or smaller, depending upon those conditions. With respect to human beings, you may be told that there is a mutant form of a gene which causes anemia, the notorious sickle cell anemia that affects Africans and African Americans in a very fatal, debilitating condition. But that this condition, precisely because it thins the blood, can be adaptive in conditions of high malaria infection, and can provide an advantage to survival, actually, in the conditions that are faced by populations that are subject to recurrent malarial infections. Now, all of this is perfectly true. I've just about summarized all of the textbook examples now of Darwinian evolution in action, and they're perfectly accurate, they're perfectly true as far as they go. The question is, what do they explain? And what they explain, of course, is how in a population which has variation, you can find that one kind of variant will be adaptive under some circumstances and another in others. What it doesn't explain, what Darwinian theory doesn't explain at all, is where you get the genetic information, the complex instructions that make biological systems operate altogether, that in fact create the complex organs of plants and animals in the first place. All of these examples simply show variation within types already in existence. But because they are adaptive, and because the variations in the size of the beaks of finches are adaptive, and because the beaks and every other organ of finches can be described as adaptations, the Darwinian claim is that we've explained adaptation, thus we've explained everything complex in biology, and thus we have made the giant step which allows us to claim a materialist explanation of everything. And to say to those who do not accept it that we will give you no standing in the world of ideas, and we will forcibly educate and indoctrinate your children in this materialist philosophy by calling it the fact of evolution, the fact of natural selection as our true creator. Well, it's not surprising that this very unscientific, this very ideologically laden philosophy is beginning to get a popular revolt. In fact, has been getting a popular revolt for some time. What is new in this popular revolt is that the revolt is beginning to find a message, is beginning to find a language which can get a hearing in the world of ideas and in the legal world. Just last week, last Thursday, the Alabama State Board of Education passed a resolution stating a text which will now have to be pasted on the inside cover of every biological textbook that is sold in that state. And the Alabama State resolution, which I'll summarize for you briefly, says essentially that high school students who are reading the evolutionary biology textbook should be aware that what they are getting presented as fact is in fact a controversial theory that some scientists present as a scientific explanation for the origin of living things such as plants, animals, and humans. And that they should be aware when they hear the word evolution that this word is used in very different senses and that the shifting uses of this word can be extremely misleading. The resolution says, as I said, this will be printed as a kind of a truth in advertising label in every textbook in Alabama, that evolution may refer to many types of change. Evolution describes changes that may occur within a species, and here it cites the peppered moth example of the shifting ratios of dark and light moths. It says this process is microevolution, which can be observed and described as fact. Evolution may also refer to the change of one living thing to another, such as reptiles into birds. This process is called macroevolution, and it has not been observed and should be considered a theory. I'm not sure that they chose the right word in saying it hasn't been observed, can't be demonstrated, and should be considered a theory. I think what they probably wanted to say is that it should be considered a speculation. I think that probably would have been a better word. Evolution also refers to the unproven belief that random, undirected forces produced a world of living things. And we see indeed, and for example in that article that I quoted to you from Richard Dawkins in the Scientific American, that Dawkins, as well by the way as just about every other leading figure in Darwinian evolution who addresses the public, has said that evolution means materialism, and that it means that we live in a purposeless world, a world which is the product of unintelligent, purposeless material forces. The Alabama State School Board statement goes on to point out certain problems in the fossil record which the textbooks do not address. And it points them out and says students should be aware of them and should be aware that the textbooks are not, in fact, telling them the full truth about the evidentiary problems that are involved with this theory. And it brings to the attention of the students of the state the information problem. It says, how did you and all living things come to possess such a complete and complex set of instructions for building a living body? So that's the information problem. Where's the program? Where's the complexity coming from that enables an organism that is a product of many different mechanisms that are all intricate and complex and all have to work together? How is the origin of that explained by the variations in the peppered moth? The resolution concludes, study hard and keep an open mind. Someday you may contribute to the theories of how living things appeared on Earth. Well, isn't this a remarkable situation? We have here a State Board of Education warning the students, putting a kind of label that you might, put on cigarette advertising or whatever, to say, don't necessarily believe everything you're told in this book is fact. The person who sent me this resolution said, I confidently predict that the American Civil Liberties Union will bring a lawsuit to prevent this from being put in the books. Now, actually, I have a higher opinion of the American Civil Liberties Union than that. I predict they won't bring that lawsuit, but I don't really know. I think there'll be a serious debate. But wouldn't that be ironic if they did? If the Civil Liberties Union said, you can't tell people to keep an open mind? Not on this subject. On any other, they can keep an open mind, but on this subject, they have to accept what authority tells them, because the authority is science. Now, you know, at the bottom, what the people of Alabama who elected those representatives who are producing this textbook resolution are trying to do is the same thing that Stephen Hawking is trying to do. They're trying to make sense out of the world. You see, they're trying to understand how things fit together. Their interest really isn't in the details of biology or of scientific investigation. I know what they're interested in. They're interested in morality. How does the world make moral sense? Stephen Hawking's interested in that too. I know that he is. And we're all interested in it. We think about, you know, what sense does a life make like his? A life that's, you know, been characterized by so much physical suffering. How does it eventually have meaning? Richard Dawkins would say there is no meaning. It's his philosophy, of course, that discourages thought, that does what Richard Dickerson said creationism does. It stifles curiosity. It prevents us from asking questions. What's the meaning of a life like that? What's the meaning of our lives? How can we make sense out of a world in which there's suffering? How can we understand the difference between right and wrong? How can we understand that postulate that I told you that our legal system instinctively makes and never even questions, that people have an understanding of right and wrong? And when they do wrong, they know that they're doing wrong. Richard Rorty says that doesn't make any sense in a Darwinian world. And it doesn't make any sense in a Darwinian world, but is that because the Darwinian explanation of life itself doesn't make sense? It ends us in a picture of irrationality. Well, consider what might be offered as an alternative view of the basis for rationality, the foundation of rational thought. That behind the world that we live in, there is not matter in mindless motion, not meaningless combinations of matter, not just genes striving to produce more genes, but a mind, that the world is the product of mind. Now, if we want to make sense out of the world, isn't that the best starting point? And if we want to understand how human beings can be searchers after objective truth, is it not best to understand them as beings who are produced by a mind, who are created in the image of a mind, which is itself the source of absolute truth, the source of objective truth? If we want to understand how human beings can have an understanding, an instinctive understanding that there's a difference between right and wrong, does it not make sense to imagine that there is a difference between right and wrong? And that is what they are reflecting in this understanding. In short, if we want a rational world, if we want to try to make sense out of the world, isn't it right that we should assume that one can make sense out of the world, not simply as a product of material causes and effects, but of something that comes from mind, that comes from a mind that makes sense, a mind which we can possibly have some a basis for understanding in part, and that is the basis for which we have hope, that a program of rationality has some hope for success. In short, if we want to know the mind of God, should we not start by assuming that God has a mind, rather than that the end of that quest is a product of materialist, purposeless forces that we will believe in, even if the evidence doesn't show that those purposeless material forces can do any creating? The path to the mind of God is through the mind and not through the matter. And that is my thesis for tonight. Well, that's the end of the lecture. We're now going to have a brief announcement from our sponsor, and then we'll get to the purpose of this whole enterprise, which is the question period.
No, I can do it. I can do it right from here. We want to take your questions, and if you would take just a minute, to fill out these cards. We have a free article we'd like to offer you. If you'd like to be updated, some of your own community, and we'd like to do a introduction like this. You might take, if this costs $1, which we will collect when we deliver it. If you would put your name, address, and you, but we'll also give you a way to access two other worldwide websites where you can pull out a number of other articles from our website.
First question. Somebody's got to start, so we all owe you thanks for beginning.
Some scientists would try to convey the impression that belief in God is something completely opposed to science. Could you give a brief listing off the top of your head of scientists that are either Christians or Jews or believe in God in some way?
The question is, many scientists say that belief in God is sort of contrary to science, and can I give a listing at the top of my head of scientists who do believe in God? I'm thinking, first place to solidify the premise of your question, I'm not sure I have with me the quotation right now. I think I don't, but just a year or two ago, the world's leading scientific journal, which is Nature, printed in Great Britain, had an editorial by its editor-in-chief, John Maddox, which said that the time is coming when surely to hold religious beliefs will be to make you an enemy of science. I mean, he said this with great glee. That to believe in God will make you an enemy of science, because he said it's essentially, like believing in astrology or whatever. To believe in a mind that is behind the universe is to believe in magic and miracles, and that's anti-science. And that's that materialistic view of science which is stated in somewhat more tactful language by Richard Dickerson in the article to which I'm referring. Richard Dawkins, who I think can fairly be described as a fanatical atheist, whenever a London newspaper makes a favorable reference to any form of religion or God or any religious leader, Dawkins can be relied upon to chime in with an angry letter to the editor denouncing them for this. He has trashed Mother Teresa, for example, in the London press. He really doesn't know where to stop. Now the irony is that Richard Dawkins gave the Christmas lectures for the Royal Institute of Science in Britain. They're on television. It's going to be released in this country as a book. The Christmas lectures are all about convincing the school children in Britain that atheism is true. And for these lectures, he was given the Michael Faraday Award by the British Royal Society. Michael Faraday being the Christian scientist, a great Christian in the history of science, for whom the lecture series was named because he combined this understanding of God and theism, you see, with scientific investigation. There are a few examples of very prominent scientists who are Christians. For example, the head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, is a well-known evangelical Christian who, however, keeps his Christianity, see, for private life and does science in the materialistic way that everybody else does it. And that, in a way, is the way I'm going to answer your question, is that while one can find examples here and there of scientists who are Christian, and one finds lots of them in applied sciences, like engineering and all, that if one is dealing with the world of official science, the world of organizational science, the governing structures of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the equivalents in other countries, you find a monolithic materialist position being advanced. And so, when someone like Richard Dawkins writes in the Scientific American about this, material world, in those circles, some people disapprove of him because they think he's being too blunt and tactless. And others agree wholeheartedly. But that's what the range of the argument is. This view of materialism, as I say, while there are individual dissenters from it, or people who in private life don't practice it and you can find it, it is the overwhelming consensus view of the scientific establishment officially. And so it's not just personal opinions. Yes, second question.
I'd like to thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. But I'd like, very quickly, I'm going to make this as short as I can, to tell you to have you tell me why I'm wrong about something. Mm-hmm. You say that it's very difficult to reconcile evolution and ethics, but I really don't think that it is. Because, see, If you're sentient, if you're self-aware, you have an incredible ability to adapt, and therefore, and this is an incredible benefit for natural selection. But one of the unfortunate byproducts of this sentience is that you start thinking about yourself and thinking about others. It is a byproduct, these ethics, not, they don't come about because if we're more ethical, we'll do better in natural selection. But they are there nonetheless. I don't really think that it is that difficult to reconcile evolution and ethics.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is something to what you say. I definitely do not want to be seen as advancing the position, you see, that if somebody believes in evolution, even in the most materialistic form, as in Richard Dawkins, that they somehow become immoral, they become thieves and robbers and murderers or something. That isn't the proposition at all. The proposition is this, is that insofar as moral rules are seen as having a grounding in the way things are, in the will of God, or in something, in objective reality, a Darwinian understanding tends to undermine that. You say that is to say that ethics are simply a matter of human decision and human choices. Now, it is perfectly true, and many people have observed that many people have made an effort to build ethical systems out of an evolutionary background by saying that, one of the things that has evolved is the human need to form societies. Societies need rules. We as rational beings can recognize the need for rules. You can even see how certain rules and standards like promise keeping, for example, or parents caring for children would enable a tribe to survive better, you see, and to do better in competition with other tribes. And so you can get a grounding for ethics in that sense in the evolutionary process itself. One person who's written along these lines, Richard Posner, famous judge and legal scholar from the University of Chicago, says, yes, you can try to get a natural law morality out of evolution by doing the kind of thing I've just said. The problem is that while promise-keeping can be justified on an evolutionary basis, so equally can genocide. You see, because what is genocide just is the replacement of one gene pool with another. You wipe out the tribe down the way and your gene pool survives, and that's grounded in reality as well. As Richard Dawkins says, DNA neither knows nor cares, it just tries to replicate its own. So the foundation of those ethical beliefs, insofar as they rely on anything outside of human choice, is very weak. The result of this is that ethics tends to be seen as something that exists for the good of society, that exists for the good of people in the here and now, and that is made up by humans from time to time as it goes along and can be changed as circumstances change. So what you get is not an absence of ethics from evolution, but a different understanding of what ethics is. Now, this can be seen in our society, by the way, and in a way we deal with this with institutions like marriage, for example. You see, is this something which was ordained by God and is unchangeable, or is it just an agreement between two people? It can be whatever they want it to be. Can it be between two people of the same sex? Can it be of a limited time, sort of, or whatever? Or if we're teaching children in the schools ethical rules, what do we teach them? Well, what we teach them now is values clarification. You see, what are your values? What's good for you? What do you believe in? We're still teaching ethics, but ethics is simply a matter of personal choice, and it rests at bottom on subjective foundations. And what tends to be the ethical problem that emerges from this, we can see this, is don't fool with anybody else. Everybody has a right to do as they please. You see, and that's the fundamental ethical rule, is don't be intolerant. So what I would say is it's not that you can't get ethics out of this system. You get a sort of ethics out of relativism itself. Let the other fellow do what he wants. It's just a different ethics than you get from an understanding of a creator's will that gives a purpose to life. And that's why there's such a culture war that, is founded on this difference. So yes, I think that the relativists have their own ethics. Next question, please.
Do you think that the claim that there's nothing but physical stuff in the world implies that there's a theory of the world, a complete theory of the world, such that some person or group of people could understand that theory?
The question is, let me make sure I've got the question right, because I think it's a very good one. That you say, does the premise that there's nothing but physical stuff in the world imply that there's a possibility of a theory of everything, of of a complete
That
understanding
a
of
human
reality.
or a group of humans could understand.
Yeah. It doesn't necessarily apply that, because what you would have to say, besides that there's nothing but matter, you'd have to say that the forces that are operating today, that are observable today, are the only ones that have been operating, you see, in all of cosmic history. You have to assume uniformitarianism in that sense, because there could be nothing but matter in physical laws, but they could have been different physical laws in the past. That, see, that's
Even
one.
granting that. Even
Yeah.
granting that.
Yeah, and then you also have to assume the existence of a mind that can understand reality. And I think this is the real a point at which the materialist understanding breaks down, because there really is not a materialist theory of the mind that I think that holds water at all. If the mind is the product of natural selection, we've already seen the problem with that, and Rorty has pointed out, it tends to lead to pragmatism as a philosophy. We know what's useful for surviving and reproducing, but why would that produce beings with an orientation towards absolute truth? The famous biochemist Arthur Kornberg from Stanford University, a Nobel Prize winner, gave an address several years ago to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where he said, Kornberg's a real devout materialist, and he said it astonished him that otherwise intelligent people, including medical doctors, did not understand that the mind as a part of nature was chemistry and only chemistry. You see, and I wrote him a letter, and I said, Professor Kornberg, this astonishes you, but I can explain it for you. The reason that they don't understand that the mind is just chemistry is because they have certain chemicals in the brain that produce non-materialist thoughts. And the reason that you think it is just chemistry is that you have different chemicals in your brain and they produce materialist thoughts. You see, so I mean, this is the problem of a materialist explanation of thinking, is how is it it produces thoughts, but why should there be any assumption they have anything to do with reality? Hawking considers this in his book. He says if we discover a theory of everything, it predicts everything, including its own self, its own theory. So how do we know that the theory of everything predicts that we'll discover a true theory of everything as opposed to a false one? There's a conundrum for you. And you know what his answer is? It's really funny. Darwinian natural selection. That because our brains are selected for being better at solving problems, which enable us to produce more offspring, they'll be selected for the qualities which will enable us to produce a true theory of everything. Well, of course, that's just another theory of the mind. Does the theory of everything will produce a true theory of evolution? But in any event, what does Hawking's own mental qualities, what do they have to do with the ability to survive in primitive conditions? Just look at his body and you see the difference between matter and mind. So no, I think the answer to your question is no. Materialism does not promise us a rational world. Indeed, that's the theme of my lecture. It leads to irrationality in the end. Next question, please. These are great. I always love the questions, and I thank you very much for coming and asking them.
You've spoken a lot so far on your ideas about evolution. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about your views on the Big Bang Theory and whether it's in conflict with creationist theory or is possibly a mechanism of God in creation. And also maybe some of your views on theories of the future of the universe, maybe like the Big Crunch or the heat death or something like that.
Well, I'm honored that you should ask my opinion on these questions. What do I think of the Big Bang, and what do I think of the future of the universe? Sort of like, how do I evaluate the goodness of God or something like that? But because indeed, I do not set myself up as an all-purpose guru of fountain of wisdom on all topics. I've made an effort to study the evolutionary biology and to master the literature of that because it is so directly related to this materialist understanding of reality. And I certainly have a much sketchier knowledge of these other subjects that you're asking about. Nonetheless, I will hazard a view for what it's worth. I love the Big Bang for the same reason that so many physicists hated it. It's a creation event. And much of Hawking's book, by the way, is an effort to get around that, to say that we can have the Big Bang and we can get away from the creation event. Because materialist science dislikes the idea that the universe had a beginning. So for theists, it's sort of congenial. On the other hand, I'm well aware it's a kind of a funny situation, it seems to me. It kind of amuses me when I read the continuing stories in the paper about how, there's the universal background radiation, there's the Hubble effect, and so on, which supports the Big Bang cosmology if you make extrapolations, of a certain kind. On the other hand, I am faintly amused when a theory is presented as absolute fact and we're told that it involves the assumption that over 90% of the matter in the universe is undetectable. Does it really exist? Who knows? Or when we're told that the current calculations make certain stars in the universe older than the universe as a whole. So obviously there's some, there's, depending on what you give emphasis to, the present state of knowledge can look absolutely secure, or it can look like things are pretty much in flux. So the way I tend to just approach these questions, I tend to take seriously a point that an awful lot of people in science give lip service to, but I don't think that they really mean it, which is that scientific knowledge at any given time is tentative. The Big Bang cosmology is certainly, I'm very eager to concede, and to affirm that it's undoubtedly the best interpretation of physical reality that we have today. But if you said, am I certain that that's still going to be the orthodoxy a century from now? I'd say no. It wouldn't surprise me terribly if things went in a different direction, if things were different. And it's for that reason that I am not interested in the way a lot of people are of unifying science and religion, of having the religious version of the theory of everything that some people would do, to say, this is how everything is and this is how it fits together with a religious consciousness or with the Bible or whatever. My own sense is that probably we know less at any given time than we think we do. Our knowledge from scientific investigation, even good scientific investigation, not Darwinism, which is, in my mind, a pseudoscience, but even really good scientific investigation, is apt to be tentative and it may be subject to change, and we should wear it lightly. I wouldn't bet my soul on it. You see, and I wouldn't try to prove God from science, because I'm more certain that God exists than I am that current scientific theories are absolutely true. So, that's my kind of take on it, which, you can, take or leave for whatever value you find in it. The next question, please.
Good evening. You may have just sort of answered my question, but let me phrase it anyway. You've questioned evolutionary theory by saying that the evidence is inadequate to fully prove the theory. What happens when we apply the same standard of evidence to creationism? Could you give us some evidence for creationism?
Mm-hmm. Well, here's as far as I would go in evidence for creationism, and this is the way I see the biological reality. Richard Dawkins says that biology is the study of extremely complicated things that look as if they were designed by a creator for a purpose. Another of the most famous Darwinists, George C. Williams, leading authority from the State University of New York, who's one of the inner circle of Darwinian authorities, says that he has come to realize that information is something very distinct from matter, and that this is applicable to biology, this insight. To explain to you what he means by this, if you look at the writing on a sheet of paper, works of Shakespeare, or even something humbler like my own book over there, or this email message I've just received, there's writing on it which conveys information, and it's written on ink and paper. But the writing is not reducible to the chemical laws of ink and paper, is it? It's something totally different, the information in the writing. And if this was previously a message that went out over the internet, you see, and the information was there present in that world of cyberspace. It was on somebody's hard disk before it was printed out, and it was in silicon form, and it was the same information. Well, George C. Williams says that you can apply the same thinking to the information in DNA. Richard Dawkins uses the word genes and DNA interchangeably. The DNA is the thing that's passed on. The genes are DNA. Williams says this is an error. The DNA is the ink and paper. It's the medium, not the message. The information is the arrangement of nucleotides, you see, that directs the protein synthesis. Information is not reducible to matter. Well, I've just written a paper about this, and it's going to be published in a journal called Biology and Philosophy, despite the disapproval of the editor. Said it'd be interesting to see, how it got attacked. And I said, well, if that's the case, if organisms contain information which is not reducible to matter, and if even a leading Darwinist is beginning to recognize this, how can that information be the product of a purely material mechanism? So it can't be. That's like trying to explain Hamlet in terms of the laws of, that govern the chemical combining of ink and paper. So I think the evidence of biology, fairly viewed, without the distorting materialist lens of Darwinism, is what I'd call creation-friendly. It doesn't prove that there's a creator, but it shows that there's an existence of something that's hard to explain or hard to understand except as the product of a mind, of design. And so, and indeed, Richard Dawkins himself, the arch materialist, would say that before the discovery of the Darwinian mechanism, that was the logical inference to draw, that there's a creator that's the source of this information. No, so he says, but it comes out of, the Darwinian materialism, but if he's dead wrong about that, then that's positive evidence for a creator. And I think this is consistent with so much else in our experience. The idea that the mind can be explained totally in terms of material and chemical forces. Anyone who goes into that at all deeply can see that it just isn't adequate. It just doesn't explain anything. It's like Kornberg, you see, in that like Professor Kornberg in that example I gave. If the thoughts are just material emanations, they really aren't thoughts at all, or they're not thoughts about reality. They're just effects. And that's not our experience of thinking at all. So I believe our everyday, ordinary experience, things like what I told you about the law, about our law of responsibility. The law just takes for granted that there's an innate difference between right and wrong and that we have a capacity to understand it. And it's not legal right or wrong. It's not what the legislature says. It's a moral right and wrong that's independent of law. And whenever the legal system has gotten away from that, it's ended in disaster. See, that's the common sense understanding that I think reflects reality, the way things really are. So that's what creation is to me. Now, did creation happen in the chronology of Genesis, and so on? People get into those issues. I really, I don't know what to say about that. I don't have any mastery of geology or of the radiometric dating evidence. I tend to assume that the Earth is old, as the geologists tell us it is, and the radiometric daters tell us it is. I can't really say, that I'm doing anything but taking their opinion, because I don't understand the science well enough to feel it as my own personal opinion, but I'm comfortable with that. And unlike a lot of other people, I'm comfortable with a lot of loose ends. There's so much we don't understand about the process of creation. What I feel is important for me, what's important in our lifetimes, is to get the investigation of all of this back on the right track. You see, to liberate people from this oppressive dogma of Darwinian materialism, and then we can start investigating, what is knowable about the creative process, and maybe then we'll learn a whole lot more about it. But for now, that's about all I know. That's the best I can do. Yeah, you're being asked to put a comment on the back of that card to give a response. Apparently that was an announcement that was meant to be made earlier and I guess wasn't. Write your comments about what you think about what I'm saying on the back of the card if you're so motivated. Next question, please. Thank you.
You talk about the Darwinian view of the world and seem to lump all of scientific theory to the same level of the theory of Darwinism and evolution. Biology is kind of a young subject who really only came of age with DNA. Right? How do you explain the other theories of physics and chemistry, the mature sciences, who have been exceedingly successful in substantiating their theories, completely materialistic theories of the world?
Well, in terms of other sciences, where science is tremendously successful is in things that can actually be tested by the experimental method. Which is to say how things operate in the here and now. In some of my lectures, I love to use the example of the Challenger space shuttle. And where you have somebody says that we're about to set the space shuttle up, and somebody says, the O-rings won't seal. there's a problem here that's too cold, and we shouldn't set it up because the whole thing will fail and it'll blow up. And you can imagine, if you like, as the thought experiment, all these Nobel Prize winners and corporate vice presidents and government officials and so on saying, oh, that's nonsense, it'll work perfectly. And so they send it up and it blows up. You say, well, that's the experimental method par excellence. We know who was right and who was wrong there, and it doesn't matter how much authority there was on, on behalf of that system. And that's where science is really successful. Now, with some other kinds of science, you see, one has to rest, it's hard to evaluate the success because one has to rest on a consensus of the experts in the field, like when we're talking about what happened billions of years ago and so on. Now, has, for example, the mature sciences, has physics, has cosmology shown a complete materialistic view of the world? I mean, I don't think it has. Assuming that the Big Bang occurred, there's an absence of an explanation of how you get galaxies and galactic clusters and all this, these sorts of things. There's a tremendous there are tremendous problems of things which are not understood. There's a growing realization that the whole system looks designed, and the fact that so many initial conditions have to be exactly so for the whole system to work. And you begin to get, physicists are talking about in mystical terms. One of the leading people in this field, the mathematical physicist Paul Davies, just won the Templeton Award for progress in religion, for advancing essentially a pantheistic view of this system. So are the physical sciences giving us a picture of a materialistic cosmos? That's not what a lot of physicists really seem to be saying. There's still a lot that's unexplained, and a lot of friendliness in that area towards design views, I would say.
Yeah, I'm just trying to clarify your point. Science does admit its shortcomings. I mean, we say here are the postulates, assuming they are true, we get to point B or so on. But I'm not sure that most scientists would agree that science can explain everything. So we do agree there's something out there that science cannot exactly touch. Now, when you say you believe in the existence of God, or you'd more likely believe in the existence of God than in the absolute truth of science, I think a lot of scientists would agree that there's something outside of science. But when you say God, what do you mean? What exactly, aside from saying that science is incomplete, how do you make progress in the other direction, saying, here's what that incomplete part is? It seems to me most of your lecture revolved around showing that, yes, it's true that science in itself is not complete, but have we made any progress in the other direction?
Yes, I think so. And I'm glad to take this opportunity in answering your question, to say that I'm honored to be a member of the editorial board of a new journal, which is just being developed. I see another member right here in front of me, Bill Dembski of this institution. It's called Origins and Design. And it is in fact meant to be a journal for discussing the scientific implications of an understanding that design operates in the physical world, that organisms are in fact designed. Now, actually, even many molecular biologists who are themselves dogmatic materialists, when you listen to the way that they talk about their subject, they talk about the libraries of information which are stored in DNA, and the information which is translated in the protein synthesis process by the messenger RNA, from the language of DNA to the protein language, and things like that. They're actually using design concepts while denying their philosophical basis. A design-oriented understanding of biology starts by saying, the question is, how does the design operate in in its chemical environment? How does it direct the operations of the cell? I think that's the logical thing for biology to be addressing in any case, and it's bound to be. The design understanding frees this from this materialist doctrine that we really can't see or acknowledge the existence of anything which we aren't confident we can explain in fully materialistic terms. So I think I see it as a liberating thing, to open up a scientific research. But more than that, one of the things I wanted to make, one of the points I wanted to be sure to make in this lecture, is that when we talk about this understanding and worldview, we're talking about something that is of interest and importance not just to the people that practice what we call natural science, biologists and physicists and so on, but to people who want to make sense of the world in other ways. They've got an interest in this too, and they want to know what the truth is. So we want to know whether materialist claims are true or not. And that's certainly a legitimate inquiry to pursue, isn't it, in your terms?
I'm not denying that, but
Yeah, I'm sure you're not.
I'm saying when you say God, what is it that you mean? I mean, is it the Judeo-Christian notion of God, which I think over the years you'd have seen many arguments or at least problems with that and difficulties with that, certainly as many as you've seen science face. So what exactly do you mean? Is it simply that which is out there beyond science?
Yeah. Now, of course, here is the point at which I think we leave science. That what my understanding of the reality of biology is that I say it's creation friendly. It's, it shows design, and hence it points to the existence of an intelligence which is outside of the material world and outside of the ken of a materialist science. At that point, I think you've gone as far as the understanding of the real world can go. I am myself, of course, a Christian theist, as everybody knows. But I wouldn't say that I get any further than this design understanding out of the evidence of biology. And I would be very disapproving of somebody who tries to get further. If you try to say, well, I'm going to prove the goodness of God from the evidence of biology, I think you're probably going to start being very selective, in the evidence that you choose. There are ticks, and things like that you have to take into account if you're going to reason that way. So I think that was what was wrong with the old program of natural theology in the pre-Darwinian days. So what we're going to know about God has to come from another root. God has to reveal himself, and that's all in a different subject. So no, I don't think we know the nature of God from scientific investigation. It's creation friendly, but it doesn't, give us the Bible. Yeah.
Okay, well, that was actually a pretty good lead into my question, that different subject. Basically, your conclusion and thesis leads to there being a God and or a creator and an absolute truth. Can you elaborate briefly or a little bit, you as a Christian theist, on the absolute truth and there being a creator? Mm-hmm.
Well, the absolute, one doesn't want to have, I might say, one doesn't want to have absolute truth in too much detail. See, that's stultifying. And I don't think, that's not my understanding of the plan of the Creator. One of the things I like to say is that we have a Creator who loves puzzles, who loves to set us puzzles to figuring things out. What we get out of Christian theism, to me, the Christian theistic understanding of reality tells us basically things exist because the Creator brought them about for a purpose. What is the chief end of human beings? What is the purpose? It's never been stated better than the Shorter Catechism. The chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And that the understanding that we are created in the image of God gives us some initial confidence, you see, that we can make sense out of the world. On the other hand, we can't leave it just there, because there's another thing, is that the world is not the way the Creator meant it to be. The truth also does not tell us, the absolute truth does not tell us that, don't do anything about the world. It's just the way it's meant to be because the Creator created that way. Don't do anything about injustice or whatever because things were meant to be that way. No, it's a fallen world. You see, that's what we also learn from Christian theology. It's a world that's not the way that it's meant to be. And the third thing that we learn is it is a world that can be and actually has been redeemed, that God has participated in this world and in the ultimate evil and fallenness of it in the most direct way, that God has himself experienced the utmost of evil and suffering and in the life of Christ, and that gives us the understanding that there is a meaning even in the life of suffering. Now, on the other hand, this understanding, I think, leaves a lot to us to find out. It's in a way, it's very analogous to the scientific understanding. Someone like Richard Dickerson would say, well, I have this understanding that, I have this faith commitment that we can solve every problem in materialist terms. See, that doesn't give me the answer. It gives me the faith that I need to go looking for answers. And that's exactly the way that I see what I think is the immensely superior Christian metaphysical account of our existence. It doesn't give us all the answers. It gives us the faith we need to see that the answers are there, to seek, so that it's not futile. So that's what I see as the true basis for rationality, not a materialistic understanding. Do we have someone else who was in line? Yes, I want to get the people who are already in line there, and then I think we'll finish this, yeah.
Hi, we've talked briefly on chemistry and physics and various issues in microevolution. I was curious on the macroevolutionary sense. When we deal with archaeology and geology, how can you refute the supposedly physical evidence of Archaeopteryx and the various series of prehistoric men, etc.?
Oh, well, that's the easiest thing in the world. And for those who want the answer in any detail, it's in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Darwin on Trial, where I go into the fossil evidence. But let me just tell you this, that if you look at the fossil evidence overall, it is the strongest reason for not believing in Darwinism. At the time that The Origin of Species was first published in 1859, Darwin's leading opponents were not clergymen. They were not Bible-thumping pastors. They were fossil experts who said this theory just can't possibly be true because the overwhelming pattern in the fossil record is that while new things seem to appear from time to time in rocks dated in different ages, they always appear fully formed and just as they are, and they stay unchanged. Persistence of stasis, absence of evolutionary change, is the rule of the fossil record. Now, that over the succeeding years, the Darwinists said a year after, well, we're going to find the transitionals, we're going to find the evidence, the fossil record is incomplete, we're going to, fill in the evidence that the Darwinian theory must be there. Darwin himself wrote, by the way, he said, I never would have realized how incomplete the fossil record was until I realized that it doesn't show any of the transitional forms my theory requires to have existed. Think about that. See, it never occurred to him to say that indicates there's something wrong with my theory. That indicates there's something wrong with the fossil record. And that was the view that paleontologists took. And Niles Eldredge, a famous paleontologist, the American Museum of Natural History, writes about this all the time. I'm going to be doing some joint appearances with in the future. Niles, writes that paleontologists went out year after year seeking to confirm Darwinian transitions, and they could never do it, and they were failures. And that this has been so frustrating. He says, evolution always seems to be happening somewhere else. You never find it recorded in the fossils. Now, of course, that when you have an army of people going out and looking for evidence to confirm a theory, they're going to find something. And so what do they find? They find a couple of things like Archaeopteryx, which are chimeras. They're things like the duck-billed platypus, it doesn't tell us anything about evolution, but it just has, it's one of these strange things that has features that belong to different classes. But it doesn't show a transition from one kind of thing to another. It's just a form with different characteristics from different forms. Now, you get the so-called hominid series, which is mainly bone fragments. It's said that you can put all of the evidence of human evolution on a large billiard table. Mostly bone fragments that are lovingly reconstructed by an army of people who know very well that if they find a human ancestor, they'll be in the front page of the New York Times and they'll become rich and famous. Now, this isn't something that can prove a theory. This is an artifact of belief in the theory. In fact, the fossil record overall is as anti-Darwinian as it can be, and it shows a tremendous accomplishment for the fossil record to have resisted so successfully a century of efforts, determined efforts of people to read it in Darwinian terms. That's what's really significant. It's not so much that there's an absence of evidence for the transitionals and positive documented evidence for the prevalence of stasis, that is, absence of evolutionary change over long periods of time. I guess that's the Princeton Board of Trustees. The fossil record has maintained this anti-Darwinian character after such a determined effort to read, every possible Darwinian interpretation into it. That's an amazing thing, and I think it's one of the many things which is just decisively discrediting to the Darwinian system. Now, it's not necessarily discrediting to evolution in every sense. You see, if you wanted to ask what the history of life was that's most consistent with the official interpretation accepted today of the geological column in the fossil record, it would be that new kinds of things have appeared over the history of the Earth, you say, mysteriously, by some means totally unknown to science, that seems to have the ability to produce fully formed new kinds of things out of nowhere. Now, is that what really happened? Or is there something wrong with our interpretation? I don't know, but that would be the interpretation that's most consistent with the fossil evidence. And the reason, of course, why it's not given is because there is no mechanism for it. It's essentially a progressive creationist view. Do we have one more or two more? We have two more. We'll get you both, and then those are the last two.
Very interested sort of in a historical context by your characterization of Darwinism as sort of being the stiflers of creative thought. And it's interesting, and it's an interesting view, and as a biologist, that's something I'll have to give some thought to. There's a wonderful historical parallel here, though. 100 years ago, it was the creationists who were in power the power of who had the power of dogma behind them. And I was sort of wondering if 100 years ago you would have gone sort of on a lecture tour to talk about the reverse, the stifling of the evolutionary point of view.
Well, it's entirely possible, because you see, what can be the oppressive force can change from time to time. That's very natural. You know, yesterday's rebel becomes today's oppressor. I certainly do not think myself that it is right that scientific investigation, for example, should be constrained by some arbitrary limits. In fact, that's my objection to Darwinism. So I certainly would make that objection if somebody were to say, well, it's all set out for us, in the book of Genesis, and you shouldn't question it. But I wouldn't want to let you go away with the idea that the premise is wholly sound, that is, that there was this oppressive force. In fact, scientists in the 19th century in Europe quite freely did their work. They tended to start, because it was the cultural assumption that, often that the Genesis account was true, or that there was a worldwide flood, or whatever. But, the Galileo episode is a singular episode. Nothing of that kind happened in the 19th century with respect to Darwin and Darwinism. In fact, look at what happened. The Darwinian theory was properly controversial in 1859, mainly because it didn't fit the evidence. It wasn't denounced by the church. On the contrary, it was accepted much more readily by the clergy than by the scientific community, as particularly the mechanism. And Darwin, when he died in 1882, was buried in Westminster Abbey, just down the road from Sir Isaac Newton. So, if there was any clerical opposition, it was practically invisible of the mildest sort. And this was true also in this country, by the way, that there was very little controversy over accepting Darwinism. One great exception to that was at Princeton Seminary, right here, where the famous theologian Charles Hodge opposed Darwinism, not on the grounds that it contradicted Genesis. He accepted, the geological column and everything. He questioned the mechanism. He said it was an atheistic materialist mechanism. I mean, in fact, his criticism was, in my opinion, completely rational and completely right, that it was an atheistic materialist mechanism that was unproved, you see. So, but Hodge was singular in opposing it at all. His successor as the leading theologian here at Princeton, Benjamin Warfield, described himself as a Darwinist of the purest water. You see, so the theory did not, in fact, meet this prejudiced opposition in the intellectual world. What was happening out in the backwoods in Tennessee, may have been different. But in the intellectual world, it was accepted by the Christian scholars and theologians too readily, in my opinion, rather than being oppressively opposed. But I oppose, a mindless dogmatism in any form. So I agree with I appreciate your suggestion. And yes, this is a big responsibility. You are asking the last question, so we're expecting it to be terrific. I don't want to put you under any pressure, but I always say that.
Well, I hope it's not redundant. I'm afraid I had prior engagements, and so I'm a little late to this meeting, and you may have already addressed this issue. And in fact, you kind of alluded to it in your last response. My question is, why are evolution and creationism or Genesis necessarily mutually exclusive?
There is nothing which is inherently mutually exclusive between evolution and creation if evolution just means a long gradual process over time where one thing grows out to another. There's no reason why a creator can't use that kind of process or any other. The reason why in our culture the two are mutually exclusive is the peculiar understanding of evolution that comes out of Darwinism and the scientific materialist philosophy that is its foundation. All of the leading authorities of Darwinism, without exception, from Darwin and T.H. Huxley at the beginning down to Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins today, have said that the Darwinian understanding of evolution is that it is a purely materialistic process of random mutations accumulated by natural selection, which is an uncaring and purposeless process, and that it is not a directed process. It accidentally happened to produce human beings, but it wouldn't do that again, and it's not directed by any intelligence. There's no input from anything outside of the purely materialistic system. So that, for example, George Gaylord Simpson, on the leading authorities who produced the neo-Darwinian synthesis, said in his book, The Meaning of Evolution, that the meaning of evolution is that man is the product of a purposeless material mechanism that did not have him in mind. So when you're talking about unguided, purposeless, materialistic evolution, you're not talking about something that is theistic in any meaningful sense of the word. Now, another way you can think about it is this, is that the theory of evolution as it is understood by scientific materialists, by Darwinists today, does not prevent you from believing in God. What it prevents you from doing is saying that God had anything to do with the creative process. You see, so that as another leading authority, Douglas Fatuma, the author of the most widely used textbook in college courses, says that Darwin made theological or spiritual explanation of the life processes superfluous. You see, God doesn't do anything in the process. So the God that you're imagining is a very laid-back, hands-off manager. It doesn't prove he doesn't exist. What it proves is that he might as well not exist. You see, that he's irrelevant to the creative process and doesn't direct it, if you accept that view of evolution. So you see, the theism and the material, what is really in contradiction is theism and materialism or naturalism. A materialism which says that matter is all there is, or a naturalism which says essentially the same thing, nature's all there is. It's a closed system of material causes and effects that cannot be accepted, it cannot be influenced by anything from outside, is inconsistent with a theism that says that something else than matter exists, God, and that God affects the material universe and is its creator. So that's where the tension is. And I want to say that the materialism and the naturalism is not incidental to Darwinism, it's essential. And the reason it's essential is because there's so little evidence of natural selection ever actually doing anything. You see, how do we know that natural selection, evolution by natural selection, produced these new forms that appear in the fossil record mysteriously out of nowhere? And we can't test the process. Well, what's heavily involved in that is a presumption that natural selection must have done it because nothing else was available. You see, that's the materialism.